Black boy found strange rope in backyard. His instinct told him to pull, then screamed. The summer heat pressed down on 12-year-old Marcus like a heavy blanket as he kicked at the dry grass in his grandmother's backyard. School had been out for 3 weeks, and the endless stretch of vacation days was beginning to feel more like a prison sentence than freedom. His phone had died hours ago, and Grandma Ellie's ancient house didn't have Wi-Fi strong enough to stream anything decent. "Boy, why don't you go outside and explore?" she had suggested from her rocking chair on the porch, her weathered hands working a crossword puzzle. "This old place has more stories than you could imagine." Marcus had rolled his eyes then, but now he found himself genuinely curious about the overgrown garden that stretched behind the Victorian house. Grandma Ellie had lived here for 40 years, ever since Grandpa Samuel passed away when Marcus was just a baby. The yard told the story of decades: rose bushes that had grown wild, a chicken coop that hadn't housed birds in 20 years, and vegetable patches that nature had slowly reclaimed. He was poking around near the old apple tree when something caught his eye. At first, it looked like just another root breaking through the soil, but as he crouched down for a closer look, Marcus realized it wasn't wood at all. It was rope, thick, weathered rope that seemed to disappear into the earth itself. His heart began to beat faster. There was something about the rope that made his skin prickle with anticipation, the same feeling he got right before opening a present or walking into a surprise party. Every instinct told him this wasn't just garden debris left behind by some long-ago landscaping project. Marcus glanced back toward the house. Through the kitchen window, he could see Grandma Ellie moving around, probably starting dinner preparations. She was always cooking something, as if feeding people was her way of showing love. The familiar clatter of pots and pans drifted across the yard, mixed with the distant hum of her old radio playing gospel music. Turning back to the rope, Marcus brushed away more dirt with his hands. The fibers were coarse against his palms, clearly old but still strong. As he cleared away leaves and soil, more of the rope became visible, forming what looked like a handle or loop. His pulse quickened. "What were you hiding, Grandpa Samuel?" he whispered to himself. Marcus had always been curious about his grandfather, the man he'd never really known. Family photos showed a tall, serious-looking man with kind eyes and calloused hands, but whenever Marcus asked about him, the adults in his family would give vague answers about how he worked hard and loved his family. It was as if there was some unspoken agreement to keep Grandpa Samuel's memory carefully polished and simple. But looking at this mysterious rope, Marcus sensed there might be more to the story. He wrapped his fingers around the exposed portion and gave it an experimental tug. Nothing happened at first, but then he felt something shift beneath the surface. Dirt crumbled away, revealing more rope, and what looked like wood. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. He pulled harder, his sneakers digging into the soft earth for leverage. With a grinding sound that seemed to echo through the quiet afternoon, a section of ground began to lift. It was a trapdoor. His hands shook as he stared at what he'd uncovered. The wooden door was roughly 3 feet square, made of heavy planks that had darkened with age. Brass hinges, green with patina, held it in place. The rope he'd found was attached to a metal ring that served as a handle. Marcus sat back on his heels, his mind racing. A secret door in his grandmother's backyard? How long had it been there? Did Grandma Ellie know about it? More importantly, did his parents know? The rational party of his mind, the part that sounded suspiciously like his mother, told him to go get an adult. This could be dangerous. Old structures could collapse. There might be gas lines or electrical wires. A dozen safety concerns his parents had drilled into him over the years bubbled up in his consciousness. But a stronger part of him, the part that had always gotten him in trouble for climbing too high or exploring too far, whispered something else entirely. This is yours to discover. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant lower, casting longer shadows across the yard. Soon, Grandma Ellie would call him in for dinner, and the moment would be lost. Tomorrow, his parents would arrive to pick him up, and who knew when he'd have another chance to investigate. Marcus made his decision. He gripped the rope handle with both hands and pulled upward with all his strength. The trapdoor groaned in protest, dirt cascading from its edges, but it opened. Cool air rushed up from below, carrying with it the scent of old wood and something else. Something that reminded him of his grandfather's old leather jacket that still hung in Grandma Ellie's closet. Peering into the opening, Marcus could see wooden steps leading down into darkness. His heart hammered against his ribs as he fumbled for his phone, remembering too late that it was finished. But the dying sunlight provided just enough illumination to make out the first few steps. They looked solid enough, though covered with years of dust and debris. Someone had built this carefully, with attention to detail that spoke of permanence rather than temporary storage. This wasn't just a root cellar or a place to hide winter vegetables. This was something else entirely. Marcus glanced back at the house one more time. Grandma Ellie's radio was still playing, and he could smell the first hints of her famous cornbread beginning to bake. Everything seemed normal, peaceful, unchanged. But he knew that whatever lay beneath his feet would change everything. Taking a deep breath that tasted of summer heat and anticipation, Marcus placed his foot on the first step. The wood creaked but held his weight. Then the second step, and the third. With each downward movement, the cool underground air enveloped him more completely, and the sounds of the world above grew more distant. As his head cleared the ground level and the trapdoor's shadow fell across his shoulders, Marcus felt as though he was crossing some invisible threshold. Behind him lay the familiar world of homework and chores and predictable summer days. Ahead of him, in the darkness below, lay answers to questions he hadn't even known he should ask. The last thing he heard before descending completely was the distant sound of Grandma Ellie's voice, calling his name for dinner. But it seemed to come from another world entirely, and Marcus found himself unable to turn back now. Whatever secrets his grandfather had buried here, whatever stories this hidden room might tell, Marcus was about to become part of them. And somehow, he knew that nothing would ever be quite the same again. Marcus counted 7 steps before his feet touched solid ground. The air down here was noticeably cooler, almost refreshing after the sweltering heat above. He stood still for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light filtering down from the open trapdoor above. As shapes began to emerge from the shadows, Marcus felt his breath catch. This wasn't just some forgotten storage space or abandoned root cellar. Someone had spent considerable time and effort creating this room. The walls were lined with wooden shelves, carefully constructed and still sturdy despite their obvious age. A small wooden table sat in the center of the space, its surface worn smooth by years of use. Most remarkably, everything was remarkably well preserved, as if the underground chamber had somehow protected its contents from the ravages of time. Marcus pulled out his phone, forgetting again that it was finished, then remembered the small flashlight on his keychain. The tiny beam wasn't much, but it was enough to begin exploring properly. The first thing that caught his attention was a collection of leather-bound journals stacked neatly on one of the shelves. There had to be at least a dozen of them, each one thick with pages and worn soft from handling. Marcus lifted one carefully, surprised by its weight. The leather cover was embossed with initials. SJW. Samuel James Washington, his grandfather's full name. His heart began to race. These were his grandfather's personal writings. Next to the journals, wrapped in what looked like an old cloth, Marcus discovered something that made him step back in surprise. Carefully unwrapping the bundle, he found himself looking at several antique weapons, not modern guns, but older pieces that looked like they belonged in a museum. There was an ornate knife with an intricately carved handle, what appeared to be an old military pistol, and something that looked like it might have been used for hunting decades ago. Marcus had never seen his grandfather as anything other than the gentleman in family photographs, the one who supposedly spent his days working at the local hardware store and tending his garden. The presence of these weapons, clearly well-maintained and deliberately preserved, suggested a completely different side to Samuel Washington. But it was the photograph tucked behind the weapons that truly stopped Marcus in his tracks. The picture was old, probably from the 1960s based on the clothing and the slightly faded color. It showed his grandfather as a much younger man, maybe in his 30s, standing with a group of other black men in what appeared to be some kind of meeting or gathering. But this wasn't the Samuel Washington that Marcus recognized from family photos. In this picture, his grandfather stood tall and confident, his expression serious and determined. He wore a leather jacket and had his arm around another man who looked equally resolute. Behind them, Marcus could make out what looked like maps or charts on a wall, and everyone in the photograph had the bearing of people involved in something important, something significant. Most shocking of all, his grandfather was holding what appeared to be the same ornate knife Marcus had just discovered, displaying it prominently as if it held special meaning. Marcus sank down onto the wooden chair, his mind reeling. The gentle grandfather he'd heard about, the quiet hardware store worker who loved his garden and doted on his family, clearly had an entirely different life that no one had ever mentioned. He opened one of the journals at random, squinting in the poor light to make out his grandfather's careful handwriting. The entry was dated 1965. Met with the others again tonight. The plan is dangerous, but we can't let fear stop us from doing what's right. The community is depending on us, and we've come too far to turn back now. Tomorrow we put everything into motion. Marcus flipped to another page, this one dated several months later. Success, but at a cost. We saved the community center, but now they know who we are. Have to be more careful going forward. The weapons will need to be hidden somewhere safe until this all settles down. The entries were cryptic but compelling. It was clear his grandfather had been involved in something that required secrecy, something that carried real risks. But the tone wasn't boastful or violent, it was thoughtful, careful, driven by a sense of responsibility rather than adventure. Marcus spent what felt like hours in that underground room, though it could have been minutes. Time seemed to move differently down there, suspended between the ordinary world above and the revelation of secrets below. Every item he examined added another layer to the mystery of who his grandfather really was. There were letters from people thanking Samuel for his help, newspaper clippings about community events and civil rights activities, and even what appeared to be meeting notes written in a kind of code. The more Marcus discovered, the more he realized that his family had kept enormous secrets about Samuel Washington's true legacy. As he prepared to climb back up into the fading daylight, Marcus carefully selected one of the journals to take with him. He needed time to process what he'd found, time to understand what it all meant. The revelation that his quiet, gentle grandfather had lived this entire hidden life filled Marcus with a mixture of pride, confusion, and burning curiosity. Who had Samuel Washington really been? And why had the family worked so hard to keep his true story buried? Marcus climbed the steps slowly, his mind buzzing with questions that demanded answers. That night, Marcus lay in his narrow bed in Grandma Ellie's guest room, the stolen journal hidden beneath his pillow. Dinner had been awkward, he'd barely managed to eat her famous fried chicken, his mind still reeling from the discoveries in the underground chamber. Every time Grandma Ellie looked at him with her knowing eyes, he wondered if she suspected what he'd found. "You mighty quiet tonight, baby," she'd said, passing him the cornbread. "Everything all right?" "Just tired," Marcus had mumbled, though he never felt more awake in his life. Now, with his grandmother's gentle snoring drifting from down the hall, Marcus carefully pulled out the journal and opened it to the first page by the light of his phone's dying battery. January 15th, 1963. My name is Samuel James Washington, and I'm writing this because someone needs to know the truth about what we did here. Not the sanitized version they'll probably tell in the history books, but the real story of how ordinary people chose to do extraordinary things. Marcus's hands trembled as he turned the page. His grandfather's handwriting was neat and deliberate, each word chosen with care. The Freedom Riders came through town last month, and everything changed. Not just for the movement, but for me personally. I realized I couldn't keep living two lives, the quiet hardware store worker by day, and the man who helped families escape trouble by night. It was time to choose who I really wanted to be. The entries that followed painted a picture of Marcus's grandfather that was completely different from the gentle, simple man his family had described. Samuel Washington had been involved in the Underground Railroad's modern continuation, helping black families relocate when their safety was threatened. He'd organized secret meetings, coordinated safe houses, and yes, sometimes carried weapons not for violence, but for protection when peaceful solutions weren't enough. March 3, 1963 had to make a difficult choice today. The Morrison family needed to leave town fast. Their boy had been asking too many questions about the voting registration drives, and word was getting around to the wrong people. We had two options: wait for official help that might not come, or take matters into our own hands. Sometimes being ethical means breaking unjust rules. Marcus read on, fascinated by his grandfather's moral struggles. These weren't the writings of a reckless man seeking adventure, but of someone wrestling with impossible choices, trying to balance safety with justice, caution with courage. April 22, 1963 met with Thomas and the others again. We've decided to establish a more permanent network. Not just reactive help, but proactive protection. The old weapons from my army days will need to come out of storage, but only as a last resort. Our strength comes from unity and intelligence, not firepower. The most surprising revelation came in an entry dated several months later. September 10, 1963. They're calling us troublemakers, but we saved 14 families this year. 14 families who can sleep safely because a group of quiet black men decided to stop being quiet. The irony isn't lost on me. The community thinks I'm just Samuel who fixes their lawn mowers and sells them screws. If they only knew their hardware store owner has been running one of the most effective protection networks in 3 counties. Marcus had to put the journal down. His grandfather hadn't just been involved in civil rights work, he'd been a leader, a strategist, someone who'd built an entire secret organization. And somehow, the family had buried this incredible legacy beneath stories about gardening and cornbread recipes. He continued reading, discovering that his grandfather's adversaries weren't violent enemies, but rather people caught up in old prejudices and misunderstandings. Samuel had spent considerable energy trying to convert opponents rather than defeat them. November 5, 1963 finally had that conversation with Sheriff Williams. Turns out he's not the villain we thought, he was just scared and misinformed. After 3 hours of talking, he agreed to look the other way during our next operation. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit you were wrong about someone. The journal revealed Samuel's philosophy: change hearts and minds when possible, work around obstacles when necessary, but never resort to violence unless there was absolutely no other choice. His weapons had been intimidation tools more than anything else, symbols of strength that usually prevented confrontations rather than causing them. December 20th, 1963. The network is growing. We now have allies in 4 counties, and even some white families are helping. This was never about creating division, it was about creating safety and opportunity for everyone. The best victories are the ones where nobody has to lose. As Marcus reached the end of the journal, he found a letter his grandfather had written but apparently never sent. To my future grandchildren, if you're reading this, then you've discovered that your old grandfather wasn't quite as simple as everyone made him out to be. I hope you understand that everything we did was about love for our community, love for justice, and love for the idea that ordinary people can create extraordinary change. The weapons weren't for fighting, they were for protecting. The secrets weren't for hiding, they were for keeping people safe until the world caught up with what was right. Marcus closed the journal, tears streaming down his cheeks. His grandfather had been a hero, but a complex one who'd chosen discretion over fame, community safety over personal recognition. The next morning, Marcus woke before dawn, the journal clutched against his chest. He'd fallen asleep reading, and his dreams had been filled with images of his grandfather as a young man, moving through shadows to protect families in danger. But there were still so many unanswered questions, so many gaps in the story that needed filling. He crept back down to the hidden room before Grandma Ellie woke up, this time bringing a proper flashlight he'd found in the kitchen drawer. The underground chamber felt different in the early morning, less mysterious, more like a library waiting to share its secrets. Marcus selected another journal, this one thicker than the first, with several loose photographs tucked between its pages. As he opened it, a newspaper clipping fell out. The headline read, "Local hardware store owner mediates successful resolution to downtown dispute." The article was brief, describing how Samuel Washington had helped resolve a conflict between black business owners and white property developers who wanted to buy them out for well below market value. But the journal entries surrounding this event told a much more complex story. February 8, 1965. The Hendersons came to me last night, scared and angry. Those developers aren't just making low offers, they're making threats. Mrs. Henderson showed me the broken windows, the warnings left on their doorstep. This isn't business anymore, it's intimidation. Marcus read on, fascinated by how his grandfather had approached the problem. Instead of responding with counter threats or calling for protests, Samuel had done something unexpected. He'd researched the developers' backgrounds and discovered that their leader, a man named Robert Mitchell, was struggling with his own family problems. February 15, 1965. Spent 3 hours talking with Mitchell today. Turns out his aggressive tactics come from desperation, not hatred. His company is failing, and he's under pressure from investors to get these properties cheap and fast. Still doesn't excuse the intimidation, but it explains it. Sometimes the person causing problems is drowning too. The journal revealed that Samuel had spent weeks building a relationship with Mitchell, slowly earning his trust while simultaneously organizing the black business owners to present a united front. But rather than creating an us versus them situation, Samuel had looked for ways to help everyone succeed. March 2, 1965. Breakthrough today. Mitchell admitted he never wanted to resort to scare tactics, but his investors were pushing him toward methods that made him uncomfortable. I proposed something different. What if we could find a way to give him the development deal he needs while ensuring our people get fair compensation and aren't forced out of their community? What followed was a masterclass in creative problem solving. Samuel had discovered that the city was planning to build a new community center and needed contractors. He'd orchestrated a complex deal where Mitchell's company got the lucrative city contract, which gave him the financial breathing room to offer fair prices for the properties he genuinely needed, while helping the displaced business owners relocate to better locations with city support. March 20, 1965. Victory, but not the kind anyone expected. Mitchell and I shook hands today as partners, not enemies. The Henderson family got twice what they were originally offered, plus help relocating to the new commercial district. Mitchell's company is stable again, and he's even hired 2 of our young men for his construction crew. Sometimes the best way to defeat an enemy is to help them stop being your enemy. Marcus found similar stories throughout the journal. His grandfather had faced various adversaries over the years: a racist police captain who was harassing black teenagers, a landlord who was discriminating against black families, even a group of young white men who had been vandalizing black-owned businesses. In each case, Samuel's approach had been the same: investigate the root cause, find the human story behind the hostile behavior, and look for solutions that addressed everyone's real needs rather than just the surface conflict. The police captain, it turned out, was dealing with pressure from city drama and genuinely didn't know how to handle racial tensions without making things worse. Samuel had worked with him to develop new community policing strategies that actually reduced crime while building trust. The discriminatory landlord was revealed to be acting out of fear rather than hatred. He'd been burned by previous tenants, and was using race as a crude screening method. Samuel had connected him with a community group that provided tenant references and support, solving his real problem while opening up housing opportunities. Even the young vandals had their story. They were recent high school dropouts with no job prospects, acting out of frustration and boredom rather than deep-seated racism. Samuel had worked with local business owners to create apprenticeship programs that gave these young men purpose and income. June 10, 1966. People keep asking me why I don't just fight back, why I always look for the complicated solution instead of the simple one. The truth is, fighting back just creates more enemies. But helping people solve their real problems, that creates allies. And allies last longer than victories. Marcus realized his grandfather had been operating on a completely different level than anyone around him understood. While others saw enemies to be defeated, Samuel saw human beings caught in difficult circumstances, making poor choices because they didn't see better options. The weapons in the hidden room finally made sense too. They weren't tools of aggression, they were insurance policies, symbols of strength that allowed Samuel to negotiate from a position of respect rather than vulnerability. Marcus spent the rest of the morning in the hidden room, reading entry after entry, photograph after photograph, slowly piecing together the complete picture of who his grandfather had really been. By the time he heard Grandma Ellie calling for lunch, he felt like he'd lived through decades of his grandfather's experiences. But it was the final journal that truly changed everything. This one was different from the others, smaller, more personal, with entries that seemed written for family rather than for history. The first page bore an inscription. "For my children and their children, so they might understand. December 1st, 1970, Ellie is pregnant with our first child. I've been thinking about what kind of world we're bringing this baby into, and what kind of man I want to be as a father. The work I've been doing, the network, the protection operations, the conflict resolution, it's been necessary, but it's also been dangerous. I've made enemies, even if I've tried to turn them into friends." Marcus's breath caught. This was written about his own father. March 15, 1971, little David is perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, and the most beautiful smile I've ever seen. But holding him today, I realize something that changes everything. I can't keep living the double life. Not because the work isn't important, but because I want to be present for my son. Really present, not always looking over my shoulder or planning the next operation. The entries that followed documented Samuel's gradual transition from active leadership to behind-the-scenes support. He hadn't abandoned his principles or his community, he'd found new ways to serve that didn't require secrecy or risk. September 22, 1972, officially handed over leadership of the network to Thomas today. It was emotional. This work has defined me for nearly a decade. But watching David take his first steps yesterday, I knew I'd made the right choice. My most important job now is being his father. Marcus realized why his family had simplified his grandfather's story. It wasn't to hide something shameful, it was to honor Samuel's own choice to prioritize family over legacy, presence over reputation. January 10, 1975, David asked me today what I used to do before working at the hardware store. He's getting old enough to sense that there are stories I don't tell. I'm not ready to share everything yet, some of it is still too dangerous, some of it he's too young to understand. But someday, I hope he'll know that everything I did was to make his world safer and more just. As Marcus read on, he discovered that his grandfather had continued his work in subtler ways. He'd used his position at the hardware store to employ young men who might otherwise have gotten into trouble. He'd quietly helped families with home repairs they couldn't afford. He'd served on the school board and city council, pushing for changes that benefited everyone but especially helped the black community. June 5, 1978, they're calling it the Quiet Revolution, all the changes we've managed to implement through official channels over the past few years. New hiring practices, better schools, improved housing codes. It's slower than the direct action we used to take, but it's more permanent. And best of all, David gets to see his father working within the system instead of against it. But the most profound entries came near the end of the journal, written in Samuel's older, shakier handwriting. October 12, 1995, David brought the baby over today, little Marcus. Holding my grandson, I thought about all the secrets I've kept, all the stories I've never told. This boy will grow up in a world that's different because of the work we did, but he'll never know the price we paid to create it. Maybe that's exactly as it should be. Marcus felt tears welling up again. His grandfather had written about him specifically. November 30th, 1999, I'm getting older, and the doctor says my heart isn't what it used to be. Been thinking about what to leave behind for David and Marcus. The journals are hidden away safely, maybe someday they'll find them, maybe they won't. But I've decided that my real legacy isn't the dramatic stories or the secret operations. It's the quiet example I try to set every day, that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, that enemies can become friends, that the hardest battles are often won through patience and understanding rather than force. The final entry was dated just months before Samuel's death. March 3, 2000. If my grandson ever reads this, I want him to know, you carry the best parts of everyone who came before you. The courage, the compassion, the refusal to accept injustice as permanent. But you also carry the wisdom to choose your battles carefully, to build bridges instead of walls, to see the human story behind every conflict. That's not weakness, son, that's strength. The kind of strength that changes the world one heart at a time. Marcus closed the journal and sat in the quiet darkness of the hidden room, finally understanding. His grandfather hadn't been keeping secrets from shame, he'd been protecting his family while showing them, through his daily actions, what it really meant to live with integrity. The man who'd helped him with homework, who taught him to fix a bicycle chain, who'd made pancakes every Sunday morning, that was the real Samuel Washington. The secret operations and hidden weapons were just one chapter in a much larger story about choosing love over fear, understanding over judgment, and hope over despair. Marcus climbed out of the hidden room for the last time that day, carefully replacing the trapdoor and covering it with leaves and dirt. But he kept the final journal clutched in his hands. This one, he decided, belonged with the family. He found Grandma Ellie in the kitchen, preparing Sunday dinner with the kind of methodical care that turned cooking into an act of love. The smell of roast chicken and sweet potatoes filled the air, mixing with the late afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. "Grandma," Marcus said quietly, setting the journal on the kitchen table. "I found something in the backyard." Ellie Washington looked up from her cutting board, her eyes moving from Marcus's face to the journal and back again. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then, slowly, she set down her knife and wiped her hands on her apron. "I wondered when you'd find it," she said softly. "Samuel always said that room would call to the right person at the right time." Marcus stared at her. "You knew? All this time, you knew it was there?" Grandma Ellie smiled, the expression transforming her weathered face. "Baby, who do you think helped him build those shelves? Who do you think kept his secrets all these years?" She pulled out a chair and sat down across from him. "Your grandfather was many things, but he was never a man who worked alone. Why didn't anyone tell me? Why didn't Dad know?" "Oh, your daddy knows," Ellie said, reaching across to touch the journal's worn cover. "We told him everything when he turned 18. But Samuel made us promise to let each generation discover their own relationship with his legacy. He didn't want the stories to become burdens or expectations. He wanted them to be gifts, given when they were needed most." As if summoned by their conversation, Marcus heard the familiar sound of his parents' car pulling into the driveway. His heart began to race. How would he explain what he'd found? How could he share something this enormous? "Go get them," Grandma Ellie said gently. "It's time for a family conversation we should have had years ago." 20 minutes later, Marcus sat in the living room with his parents and grandmother, the journal open on the coffee table between them. His father, David Washington, had tears in his eyes as he looked at his son. "I've been waiting 12 years to have this conversation with you," his father said. "But Mom was right, it had to happen naturally, when you were ready to understand what it all means." Marcus's mother, Sarah, reached over and squeezed his hand. "We've been watching you grow up, seeing so much of your grandfather in you, the way you stand up for kids who get picked on at school, the way you always look for solutions instead of just complaining about problems. We knew you'd find your way to his story eventually." "Tell me everything," Marcus whispered. And so they did. His father shared memories of growing up knowing his father was involved in important work, but not understanding the details until he was older. His mother talked about how Samuel had helped her own family when they first moved to the neighborhood, quietly ensuring they felt welcomed and protected. Grandma Ellie filled in the gaps with stories about the network's later years, how Samuel had gradually transitioned from active leadership to elder guidance. "The beautiful thing about your grandfather," his father said, "was that he never stopped being who he was. Whether he was mediating a community dispute or teaching you to tie your shoes, he brought the same patience, the same belief that people could be better than their worst moments." As the evening wore on, Marcus learned that the legacy hadn't ended with Samuel. His father served on the city council now, continuing the work of building bridges and creating opportunities. His mother ran a nonprofit that helped families in crisis, carrying forward the tradition of protection and support. Even Grandma Ellie, with her endless cooking and caregiving, was part of the same spirit of service. So what happens now? Marcus asked as the sky darkened outside the windows. Now you get to choose, his father said. You know the full story, you understand where you come from. The question is, what are you going to do with that knowledge? Marcus thought about his grandfather's words. Ordinary people can do extraordinary things. He thought about the bullies at school, the homeless man he passed every day on his way to the bus stop, the elderly neighbor who struggled with her groceries. I want to help people, he said finally. Not the dramatic stuff, the everyday stuff. The way Grandpa did. Grandma Ellie's smile was radiant. Then you've learned exactly what he hoped you would. That night, as Marcus lay in bed, he felt different somehow, not because he'd discovered family secrets, but because he'd discovered family strength. The hidden room in the backyard had been full of artifacts from his grandfather's extraordinary life, but the real treasure was simpler, the understanding that heroism wasn't about secret operations or hidden weapons. It was about choosing, every single day, to see the humanity in other people and to use whatever gifts you had to make their lives a little better. It was about building bridges instead of walls, seeking understanding instead of victory, and believing that even the smallest acts of kindness could ripple outward to change the world. Marcus Washington, grandson of Samuel, carrier of stories and keeper of hope, fell asleep planning how he could make his corner of the world a little more just, one ordinary extraordinary act at a time.